In the quiet town of Ridgewood, nestled on the outskirts of New York, lived two women whose lives had been intertwined for as long as they could remember. Sophie and Madeline had always been close, like two sides of the same coin. Both were in their early 30s, yet their lives were at very different crossroads. Sophie, 31, had always been the more pragmatic of the two. She had settled into a steady, predictable life. She was married to Ethan, a 33-year-old software developer she had met during her first year of college. Ethan was reliable and calm, the type of person who always knew how to handle any situation. Their marriage had always been solid, or so Sophie had thought. However, something had changed recently. Ethan had become distant. He spent more time working late at the office, and the connection between them seemed to fade, leaving Sophie wondering if their marriage was as perfect as she once believed. Madeline, on the other hand, was the free spirit. At 29, she had never settled down the way Sophie had. She had a carefree personality, always the life of the party, and had a string of short-term relationships but no serious commitments. She worked as a freelance photographer, traveling often for her work. She admired her sister's life from afar but secretly longed for the stability Sophie had. Still, she couldn't deny the growing unease she felt whenever she saw Sophie and Ethan together. There was something in their interactions that made her question their happiness. One evening, the two sisters sat together at the Oakwood Cafe, their favorite spot in Ridgewood. The cafe, a cozy little place with rustic charm, had always been their sanctuary, a place where they could talk about everything: love, life, and their dreams for the future. Sophie stirred her coffee absent-mindedly as she glanced at Madeline. "Have you noticed anything different about Ethan lately?" she asked, her voice quiet and unsure. Madeline raised an eyebrow, sensing the underlying tension. "Different? Like how?" "I don't know," Sophie sighed. "He's been distant. We barely talk anymore. And when we do, it's like he's not really there, you know?" Sophie's voice trailed off, and she suddenly felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Madeline leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. "Maybe it's just a phase. You know how men are, sometimes they just need space." Sophie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Little did she know, her world was about to be turned upside down in ways she couldn't even imagine. Over the next few days, Sophie couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest. It wasn't just Ethan's silence, it was the way he avoided her. Even when they were in the same room, his gaze seemed to wander, and his mind was elsewhere. The once intimate conversations they had over dinner now felt like forced exchanges, as if they were two strangers caught in a routine. Sophie tried to brush it off, but each time they spoke, her heart ached just a little more. One night, after dinner, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Ethan to return from one of his late work sessions. The house was eerily quiet. She had spent the evening scrolling through old pictures on her phone, reminiscing about the way things used to be when they were happy, before all of this distance crept in. Sophie's thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Madeline. "I'm worried about you. You haven't said anything about Ethan lately. Is everything okay?" Sophie sighed and typed back, "I don't know. Something's off. He's been acting strange, and I just can't figure out why." A few moments later, Madeline replied, "Call me when you can. I'm here for you." Sophie didn't know why, but she suddenly felt a deep need to confide in Madeline, to share everything she was feeling. Madeline had always been her sounding board, and Sophie knew she could trust her. Yet, even as she typed out a quick response, another thought crossed her mind. What if Madeline knew more than she was letting on? As if on cue, Ethan entered the room. He looked tired, his eyes sunken, his face drawn. He didn't even acknowledge Sophie as he dropped his bag on the couch and began to change out of his work clothes. Sophie's heart raced. She had been waiting for a moment like this, a chance to confront him, to ask him what was going on between them. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she just watched him silently, her fingers nervously tapping on the table. After a long, tense silence, Sophie finally spoke. "Ethan, we need to talk." He stopped, his back turned to her. He sighed heavily before slowly turning to face her. "What about?" "You know exactly what about," Sophie replied, her voice trembling but firm. "You've been distant lately. You're not here, not really. And I don't know what's going on, but it's eating at me. Are you? Are you seeing someone else? The question hung in the air, thick with tension. Ethan's expression faltered for just a second. Sophie noticed the brief hesitation, and it was enough to make her stomach churn with a mix of dread and disbelief. I'm not seeing anyone else, Ethan said quickly, almost too quickly. Sophie, this is just work stress. I've been under a lot of pressure, and I didn't want to drag you into it. I'm sorry if I've been distant, but it's not what you think. Sophie didn't know whether to believe him. His words felt hollow, like they were meant to appease her rather than address the root of the problem. She wanted to trust him, to believe that everything was fine, but the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. There was more to this than just stress. Then what is it, Ethan? Why do I feel like I'm losing you? Sophie's voice cracked, and she could no longer keep the tears at bay. Ethan reached out to her, but Sophie pulled back, afraid of what he might say next. She needed answers, not more empty promises. The next day, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Ethan. Despite his assurances, something told her that there was more to the story. She needed to know the truth. Madeline called her in the afternoon, sensing her sister's distress. Sophie, are you okay? She asked, her voice gentle but laced with concern. I don't know, Maddie, Sophie replied, her voice shaky. I feel like I'm going crazy. Ethan's acting weird, and I can't figure out why. He keeps saying it's work stress, but I don't believe him anymore. Maybe he's hiding something, Madeline suggested cautiously. Maybe it's time you take a closer look. You deserve the truth. Sophie didn't want to believe it, but the words struck a chord. Could Ethan really be hiding something from her? It wasn't like him to keep secrets, but lately, he had been distant in ways she couldn't ignore. Her mind raced with possibilities, and each one made her feel more uneasy. That evening, Sophie decided to take a different approach. Instead of waiting for Ethan to come to her, she would confront him directly. She would ask him about the things that had been bothering her, and she wouldn't stop until she got the truth. As she sat on the couch waiting for Ethan to come home, Sophie's phone buzzed with a message from Madeline. Sophie, I know this is hard, but trust your instincts. You're stronger than you think. I'm here for you, no matter what. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Tonight, everything would change. She just didn't know how. The night felt heavier than usual. Sophie had spent the entire day stewing over her thoughts, each one darker than the last. She knew she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Ethan had to tell her the truth. She couldn't live in this limbo any longer. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Ethan finally came home. He was quiet, as usual, but Sophie's nerves were on edge, her mind racing with questions. She didn't greet him with her usual smile or casual conversation. Instead, she sat on the couch, her arms crossed, watching him closely. How was your day? Ethan asked, trying to sound casual, though the tension in the room was palpable. Sophie didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up, facing him. We need to talk, Ethan. Ethan's expression faltered. He had been hoping this moment would never come, but now it was inevitable. Sophie, I told you no, Sophie cut him off. I'm done with excuses. I know something's wrong, and I need to know what it is. Why are you avoiding me? Why do you seem so distant? Are you seeing someone else? Ethan stiffened at the question, his face paling. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She had to know. She deserved to know the truth. You don't have to hide it from me. I'm not stupid. I can feel it. There was a long pause. Sophie could see Ethan's mind working, his internal struggle clearly written on his face. Finally, he lowered his gaze and sighed deeply. There's something I've been keeping from you, Sophie. Something I never wanted to admit. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. What is it? She whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Ethan hesitated, then finally met her eyes. I've been seeing someone else. The words hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. She felt as if the room had suddenly grown smaller, the air thicker. She wanted to scream, to throw something, but instead, she just stood there, frozen in place. "You've been seeing someone else?" Sophie repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his face a mixture of guilt and regret. "I never meant for this to happen. It started out as a mistake, and I tried to end it, but I couldn't. I'm so sorry, Sophie." Sophie felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had trusted him with everything. And now, everything was falling apart. The betrayal burned through her chest, leaving a raw, empty space where once there had been love. "I don't even know who you are anymore," Sophie whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "I thought I knew you. I thought you were the person I was going to spend my life with." Ethan took a step toward her, but Sophie backed away, shaking her head. Don't touch me." The silence in the room was deafening. Sophie couldn't even look at him anymore. The person she had built her life around was a stranger. A part of her wanted to run, to leave this broken relationship behind, but another part of her couldn't shake the pain, the disbelief. Ethan stood there, helpless. He had ruined everything. The days after that night were a blur for Sophie. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. The betrayal had shattered something inside her. She barely left the house, spending most of her time in bed, wrapped in the blankets that had once brought her comfort. Now, they felt like a prison. Madeline called every day, checking in on her. At first, Sophie didn't have the energy to talk, but eventually, she gave in. Madeline came over to visit, bringing lunch and a few words of comfort. "You don't deserve this, Soph," Madeline said as they sat together on the couch. "You're an amazing person, and you deserve someone who will love you the way you love them. Don't let Ethan drag you down." Sophie wiped her eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and shame. "I don't know what to do. I thought I knew him. I thought we had something real, but now I don't even recognize him." Madeline gave her a reassuring smile. "You'll figure this out. You're stronger than you know." Sophie wanted to believe her, but the doubt still gnawed at her. Could she really let go of everything she had built with Ethan? Could she move on after everything he had done? The answers felt like they were just out of reach. But there was one thing Sophie was sure of: she couldn't live like this anymore. She needed to rebuild her life, piece by piece. She needed to find herself again, without Ethan, without the lies. And that journey would begin now. As the days turned into weeks, Sophie began to find small moments of peace. She started going to the cafe again, the one she and Ethan used to visit every Sunday morning. It was a strange feeling, walking in without him by her side, but she felt a sense of reclaiming her own space, of taking back control of her life. She met Madeline there one afternoon, as they often did. Sophie had taken up journaling to work through her emotions, and Madeline was always there, offering a listening ear. "I'm proud of you, Soph," Madeline said, sipping her coffee. "You're doing what you need to do for yourself. It's not easy, but you're doing it." Sophie smiled faintly. "I'm trying. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm going to figure it out." At that moment, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. She was still raw, still healing, but she was moving forward. One day at a time. Sophie had spent months trying to pick up the pieces of her life, but every so often, the weight of what had happened would hit her again. She'd been working at the same job, going through the motions, but it wasn't the same. The life she had planned with Ethan had crumbled, leaving her to face the future with uncertainty. One evening, she found herself walking through the city, a warm breeze rustling the trees around her. The streets of Portland had always felt familiar, comforting, but tonight they seemed different. There was a sense of freedom in the air, an openness that Sophie had never noticed before. She paused in front of the art gallery, her reflection staring back at her in the glass doors. It was strange, she hardly recognized the woman she saw. The woman who had been so consumed by love, by trust. But the woman looking back at her now was someone who had endured pain and loss, someone who had found a way to survive. Sophie took a deep breath and kept walking, her steps determined. The past was behind her, and though it still had its hold on her, she knew it no longer defined her. Several months had passed since Sophie had ended things with Ethan, and the weight of their relationship still lingered, though it had dulled with time. Sophie's friends, including Madeline, had noticed her gradual transformation. She had grown quieter, more introspective, but there was also a newfound strength in her eyes. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie met Ethan at a park, not far from where they had once spent afternoons together, walking hand in hand, lost in conversation. Ethan had called her a few times over the past couple of weeks, asking if they could meet, to talk. And after weeks of avoiding him, Sophie agreed. "I don't know why I agreed to this," Sophie confessed, standing a few feet away from him. "I don't know what you want, Ethan. I need you to know that I'm sorry," Ethan began, his voice tinged with regret. "I've made a mess of everything, and I don't know if I can ever make it right. But I need you to know how sorry I am for what I did to you." Sophie really looked at him, for the first time in months. The man who once promised her forever now seemed like a stranger. She had spent so much time thinking about what he had done, about how he had betrayed her, that she had almost forgotten to ask herself, what did she need? "I don't need your apology," Sophie said quietly, her voice firm but soft. "What I needed was honesty. What I needed was respect. And I needed love, Ethan. Something you couldn't give me." Ethan opened his mouth to say something, but Sophie held up her hand. "I've spent so long thinking about us, about what we had. But I can't keep looking back. I can't keep holding on to something that's not there anymore." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and Sophie felt a pang of guilt. But she knew it was time for her to move on. She couldn't save him, she had to save herself. Sophie turned away from him, walking down the path alone, feeling a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't look back. She had made her choice. In the months that followed, Sophie's life began to unfold in new and unexpected ways. She started a new project at work that reignited her passion for design. She took up photography, capturing moments of beauty in the world around her that she had once overlooked. And slowly, she began to open up to new friendships, including some of the people Madeline had introduced her to. The cafe where she and Ethan used to go became a place of reflection for her now, but instead of sadness, it brought a sense of peace. One morning, while sipping a cup of coffee and writing in her journal, Sophie met someone new. Her name was Clara. She was a fellow artist, someone who shared Sophie's love for creativity and exploration. They hit it off immediately, talking for hours about art, life, and everything in between. As their friendship deepened, Sophie found herself looking at the world in a new light. She realized that while her past had been painful, it had shaped her into the person she was becoming, someone stronger, more resilient, and ready to embrace what the future had in store. A year had passed since Sophie had made the choice to leave Ethan behind, and though the scars of the past would never fully disappear, Sophie was no longer defined by them. She had learned to embrace her own independence and to trust herself again. She had learned that sometimes, the hardest battles were the ones fought within. And through that struggle, she had found a new version of herself, someone who was whole and capable of love, both for others and for herself. Sophie stood at the edge of a new chapter in her life, ready to face whatever came next. The city of Portland was bustling around her, full of opportunities and new beginnings. She didn't know where the road would take her, but she was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. Because now, for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt at peace. She smiled to herself, knowing she had finally found the freedom she had been searching for all along.